Chapter 10. Communication Lag. The exact definition of a communication lag is the length of time intervening between the posing of the question or origination of a statement and the exact moment that question or original statement is answered. If you will look very closely at this definition, you will discover that nothing is said whatever about what goes on between the asking of the question or the origination of the communication and its being answered. What goes on in between is lag. It does not matter if the pre-clear stood on his head, went to the North Pole, gave a dissertation on botany, stood silent, answered some other question, thought it over, attacked the auditor, or began to string beads. Any other action but answering and the time taken up by that action is communication lag. An auditor has to understand this very thoroughly. Usually, he interprets a communication lag as the length of time it takes the pre-clear to answer the question, and loosely applies this as the length of time between the asking of the question and the first moment the pre-clear starts to speak. This is not communication lag, for the pre-clear may start to speak on some other subject, may desire more information, may almost answer the question, and still not actually answer the question. If you will look around at people, you will find them possessed of a great many communication lag mechanisms. In their effort not to be an effect, or in their effort not to be cause, in their aberrations about compulsive communication and inhibitive communication, and in indulging in impulsive, compulsive, and inhibitive communication, they manage to assemble quite a number of interesting mechanisms, but all these mechanisms are communication lag. Here is an example of communication lag. Joe. How are you, Bill? Bill. You look fine, Joe. Here the question was never answered at all, and would go on as a communication lag from there until the end of the universe. Here is another example. Joe. How are you, Bill? Bill. After 20 seconds of study. Oh, I guess I'm all right today. As this is the commonest form of communication lag, it is the most readily observed. Less well known is the following communication lag. Joe. How are you, Bill? Bill. What do you want to know for? Again, this question goes on unanswered until the end of the universe. The most maddening kind of communication lag is, Joe. How are you, Bill? Bill. Silence from there on out. This is dramatized when people anxiously inquire of an unconscious person how he is, and they become entirely frantic. They are simply looking at a communication lag which they believe will become total, and their anxiety is simply their multiple suffering on the subject of communication lag. Here is another type of communication lag. Joe. How are you, Bill? I was saying to Ezra the other day that I've seen a lot of sick men in my time, but you certainly look pretty bad, Bill. Now, how are you? I've been down to see the doctor, and he was telling me there's a lot of these colds and things going around. In other words, Joe never gives Bill an opportunity to reply, and this is the other side of communication lag. An auditor's understanding of the subject of communication lag is brief if he believes that it is the lag between the originator of the communication and the person to whom it is addressed. On our graph A, Chapter 9, this would be from Joe to Bill Prime. See foldout chart in the audiobook directory containing the graphs from Chapter 9. There is a return lag, and that is from Bill Prime to Joe Prime. And as above, there is the lag between Joe and Joe, where Joe simply keeps on talking without ascertaining if there is any Bill Prime there. You could also call this return lag an acknowledgement lag. Joe to Joe is not a communication at all. Actually, Joe to Bill Prime without a completion of the cycle is the same thing. Joe Prime never acknowledges the communication, and so the return lag is actually Joe to Joe. The proper sequence of such a communication is Bill Prime to Joe Prime. In other words, Joe Prime, to make a complete cycle of communication, must acknowledge in some manner, verbal or gesture, that Bill Prime has said something. Joe to Joe as a communication lag, which is to say no acknowledgement, has as its initial root an absence for Joe of Bill to Bill Prime in graph B. In other words, Joe has been called upon to originate communication so consistently that he now does so compulsively and obsessively, since there has been an entire scarcity of other people originating communications. Now let us look at a highly specialized type of communication lag. Here we have Joe to Bill Prime to Joe Prime, as in graph A. Then we have Joe waiting for Bill in graph B to originate a communication, If Bill does not and only silence ensues, Joe then originates another communication. In other words, we have no two-way communication. The two-way cycle of communication is not quite as important in auditing as it would be in life. For in auditing, the auditor, perforce, is originating communications in order to get the pre-clear up to the point where he can originate communications. One does not remedy life by approximating it exactly in the auditing room. The process is so designed that it will accomplish a rehabilitation in life without, to a marked degree, having to live it. As an example of this, the auditor does not expect the pre-clear to turn around and originate some process to make the auditor well, but the auditor does expect to get audited by somebody, sooner or later, or expects to be at a level where he can rise above this need of a communication interchange in order to live. The place auditors have the most trouble with in communication lag is the return lag. Auditors seldom acknowledge the execution of the command on the part of the pre-clear. As in opening procedure of 8C, a process which is one of the 6 basic processes today, the auditor sends the pre-clear over to touch the wall. When the pre-clear has touched the wall, the auditor is quite prone to give another command without acknowledging the fact that the pre-clear has touched the wall. It is an amazing thing what the lack of acknowledgement will do to slow down a case recovery. Many times when an auditor is doing this, is acknowledging, he is doing it in such a perfunctory fashion that the pre-clear does not recognize it as an acknowledgement, but as a prelude to a new command. A good auditor makes very, very sure that the pre-clear knows the acknowledgement has occurred. As an example, the auditor says, "Go over to the wall and touch it." The pre-clear does so. The auditor says, "Very good." And with a definite pause after this acknowledgement, says, "Now go over to that wall and touch it." In other words, the auditor who is a good auditor makes sure that the pre-clear knows that a complete cycle of communication has occurred on this particular auditing command. Another failure on the part of auditors is to fail to let the pre-clear originate a communication. The auditor tells the pre-clear, "Go over to that wall and touch it." The pre-clear does so, but stops midway in the gesture and gasps, then completes the gesture. The bad auditor will fail to note and inquire after this gasp. This is actually the origin of a communication on the part of the pre-clear. He does not verbalize it. He does not express it any further than some physical gesture or a look of dismay. And even these might be slight. But this is usually as far as he can go in originating a communication. The auditor who fails to pick this up fails to inform the pre-clear thus that the pre-clear is permitted to originate a communication. This gasp, this gesture, should at once be noted by the auditor with, "What's happened?" or "What's the matter?" or "Something happened?" This gives the pre-clear the opportunity to originate a second cycle of communication. Remember that the gesture or the gasp was actually a communication. The pre-clear probably will not acknowledge the auditor's statement beyond starting out on the origin of a new communication. But the fact that he does originate a statement on the subject of "What is the matter?" is, in itself, an acknowledgement of the fact that he has heard the auditor. This is so vital that many cases have stumbled, tripped, and bogged, simply because the auditor did not encourage the pre-clear to make a statement as to something which had occurred. Actually, the more often an auditor can do this, the better auditor he is, and the more good will be done by auditing. Now, of course, there is an opposite side to this, where the auditor can give credence to an obsessive or compulsive outflow on the part of the pre-clear to such an extent that the auditing is entirely interrupted. An example of this occurred recently, where a pre-clear outflowed at an auditor 3 days and 3 nights without the auditor recognizing entirely that this was simply obsessive communication in action. But this is not communication. This is not pertinent to the situation, and the definition of compulsive or obsessive communication is an outflow which is not pertinent to the surrounding terminals and situation. In other words, compulsive or obsessive communication is an outflow which is not in reality with the existing reality. We see then that an auditing session really does include a two-way cycle of communication. But it does not include it ever unless the auditor invites the pre-clear to comment upon what is going on as he does processes. Just as a side comment here, the way to handle an obsessive or compulsive communication is to wait for a slight break in the flow and interject an auditing command. Remember that an obsessive outflow is actually not a communication. A communication is on the subject and is in agreement with the environment. it is also in agreement with what is occurring. Now, it doesn't happen to matter what process is being done. The basic of that process is two-way communication. In auditing, as in living, communication is existence. In the absence of communication, we have silence. And where we have silence, we have no time. Time is manifested in communication lag to the extent that the pre-clear has been subjected to silences or such a thing as an obsessive or compulsive outflow, which had nothing to do with communicating on the subject at hand, which is, again, a sort of silence. Somebody talking obsessively or continually about things which might or might not exist, and to no one in particular without expecting any cycle of communication to take place. A communication lag is handled by an auditor by repetition of the question or command which elicited a communication lag. Here is an example. Bill. How are you, Joe? Joe. Silence, silence, silence. Finally a grunt. Bill. How are you, Joe? Joe. Silence, silence. Okay, I guess. Bill. How are you, Joe? Joe. I'm all right, I tell you. Bill. How are you, Joe? Joe. Silence. I'm okay. Bill. How are you, Joe? Joe. All right, I guess. Bill. How are you, Joe? Joe. All right. Bill. How are you, Joe? Joe. Oh, I'm all right. This is an example of flattening a communication lag. At first we have silence and no very intelligible reply. Then we have silence and a reply. And then other manifestations, each one of which demonstrates a changing interval of time until the last couple of commands, 3 in actual auditing practice, where the same interval of time was present. Flattening a communication lag requires only that the pre-clear answer after a uniform interval of time at least 3 times. This uniform interval of time could, for practical purposes, be as long as 10 seconds. Thus, we get lengths of time required to answer an auditing question as follows. Answer requires 35 seconds. Answer requires 20 seconds. Answer requires 45 seconds. Answer requires 20 seconds. Answer requires 10 seconds. Answer requires 10 seconds. Answer requires 10 seconds. To all intents and purposes, with these 3 last 10-second intervals, the auditor could consider that he has to some degree flattened this particular auditing command because he is getting a consistent response. However, with such a long lag as 10 seconds, the auditor will discover that if he asked the question 2 or 3 more times, he would recover a changing interval once more. This is the mechanical formula of flattening a communication lag. Give the order, as in opening procedure of 8C, or ask the question, as in straight wire, and then continue to give that same order or ask that same question until the pre-clear executes it after a short interval 3 times the same. There is an entirely different manifestation for a completely flattened communication lag. We get extroversion. The pre-clear ceases to put his attention on his mind, but puts his attention on the environment. We see this happen often in the opening procedure of 8C, where the pre-clear has the room suddenly become bright to him. He has extroverted his attention. He has come free from one of these communication tangles out of the past and has suddenly looked at the environment. This is all that has happened. On a thinkingness level, this happens quite often. The pre-clear is doing the process very well and then begins to remember odds and ends of appointments he has, or some such thing. Just because he does this is no reason the auditing session should be ended. It simply demonstrates an extroversion. You have, in one way or another, pulled the pre-clear out of a communication tangle and put him into present time when he extroverts. Communication lag as a subject could be a very large one. We have all manner of communication lags in evidence around us. Probably the most interesting one is the shock reaction after an accident, which one occasionally sees. At times it takes the body 36 hours to find out and reply to the fact that it has received an impact. It is quite common for a body to suddenly manifest the impact half an hour after it. This is communication lag. There are many humorous angles to communication lag. Sometimes you ask somebody, "How are you?" and you get a reply from his social machinery. He says, "I'm fine." Then 2 or 3 hours later, he is liable to say to you, "I feel terrible." This is the pre-clear himself answering. This is the awareness of awareness unit awakening to this communication lag. This universe could be called a consistent and continual communication lag. One is trapped in it to the degree that he is lagging. If there were no remedy for communication lag, I would never bring up the subject. However, there is, and it is a remedy which is easily undertaken in auditing today. Entrapment is actually communication lag. One has waited for communications which never arrived, or has expected something to answer so long and so often that he becomes fixated upon something or in something and so does not believe he can escape from it. The first and foremost factor in communication lag, of course, is time, and the next factor is waiting, which is also dependent upon time. As has been commented earlier, the only things which float on the time track are the moments of silence when no communication occurred. These are no-time moments, and so have no time in which they can live, and so they float forward on the time track. It is an oddity that an engram behaves in such a way as to put all its silent moments in present time with the pre-clear and leave its talking or action moments back on the track. When we took a person back to birth and ran out birth, we took out the action moments. If we did not take out as well the silent moments in birth, we did not take out the very things which pinned themselves to the pre-clear in present time. In other words, the birth engram did not move at all, but the silent moments in birth might have a tendency to come up into present time. These silent moments in engrams and facsimiles do themselves compose the matter extant in the pre-clear. This matter is not so much composed of action moments as silent moments. Thus we see that an individual, the longer he lives in this universe, the more communication lag he runs into, the more upset he is about existence, the greater his communication lag, the more he is silent. Of course, obsessive or compulsive communication is just one grade above silence. It is the last frantic effort to keep things from going entirely quiet. It is not communication and is actually silence of a sort, particularly since very few people listen to it. Now, we are studying about communication, and we are communicating about communication, and you have every opportunity here to get yourself beautifully snarled. So I would ask you to look around your environment and check a number of manifestations of communication lag. You are not controlled by the subject. You can easily control it. The dangerous thing is not to know the answers and simply go on in these consistent and continual communication lags imposed upon us by the lack of communication in this universe. It is of great interest to note that imagination as a function of existence becomes drowned in an absence of communication origin. An individual can become so dependent upon others or entertainments in originating communications that he himself does not. Indeed, it is very unpopular in this society at this time to originate communications. One should always say that somebody else thought of it first, or that it goes back to the ancient Ugluks, or that it's happened many times before, or that one has just dug up the information after it has been buried, or one is really taking direction from the archangel Smearl, rather than stand up and plead guilty to originating a communication. Unless one can originate communications, one's imagination is in bad shape. The reverse does not happen to be true. The imagination is not that thing which is first imperiled and then results in failure to originate communication. Failure of communication origin then results in failure of imagination. So the rehabilitation of communication origin rehabilitates as well the imagination. This is very good news indeed for anyone in the creative arts particularly, but who is not in the creative arts? In examining the whole subject of communication, one discovers that there are very few people around him in this day and age who are actually communicating, and there are a lot of people who think they are communicating who are not. The AMA would like to believe that I am in the latter category. Chapter 11. Pandeterminism. An entirely new concept in Dianetics and Scientology is that of pandeterminism. In Book 1, we talked about self-determinism. Self-determinism meant, in essence, control by the awareness of awareness unit of that which it conceived to be its identity. Some effort in Book 1 was made to move self-determinism out into the remaining dynamics. Pandeterminism is a word which describes determinism all along the dynamics. Actually, self-determinism attempted to do this, and our earlier idea of self-determinism was a sort of pandeterminism. We have to remember here that the dynamics involved in Dianetics are the first 4. The dynamics involved in Scientology are the last 4 of the total set of 8. The 8 dynamics are as follows. The 8 dynamics. Dynamic 1 is the urge toward survival as self. Dynamic 2 is the urge toward survival through sex or children and embraces both the sexual act and the care and raising of children. Dynamic 3 is the urge toward survival through the group and as the group. Dynamic 4 is the urge toward survival through all mankind and as all mankind. Dynamic 5 is the urge toward survival through life forms, such as animals, birds, insects, fish, and vegetation, and is the urge to survive as these. Dynamic 6 is the urge toward survival through the physical universe and has as its components matter, energy, space, and time, from which we derive the word mest. Dynamic 7 is the urge toward survival through spirit and would include the manifestations or the totality of awareness units, thetans, demons, ghosts, spirits, godlings, and so forth. Dynamic 8 is the urge toward survival through the Supreme Being, or more exactly, infinity. It is called Dynamic 8 because it is infinity, the symbol, turned up on its side. The urge toward survival through self, sex, children, groups, and mankind are the proper province of Dianetics. Now let us examine this concept of pandeterminism. Pandeterminism would be the willingness to determine or control self and dynamics other than self up to the 8 listed above. Like self-determinism, pandeterminism is self-elected, or self-determined, in that one does it knowingly and directly, not from obsession, compulsion, or inhibition. An undetermined individual, of course, does not exist. But an other-determined individual definitely can exist. Where we have self-determinism and we interpret self-determinism as determinism on the first dynamic, we have only willingness to control self and no willingness to control anything beyond self. If this is the case in self-determinism, we have as other determinism sex, children, groups, mankind, and, going on into Scientology, animal life, vegetation, the physical universe, spirits, and God, or whatever else might compose infinity. In view of the fact that self-determinism was interpreted in this fashion, it left an individual in the state of mind of being willing to be determined on all other dynamics and by all other dynamics except his own personal dynamic. In view of the fact that a personal dynamic cannot exist, and in view of the fact that all auditing is the third dynamic, and that an individual as we see him, a man, is actually a composite and is not a first dynamic, but a third dynamic, we see we are in difficulties with this definition of self-determinism and continued use of self-determinism. It is necessary, then, to investigate further and to assign more precision to this concept of willingness to control. When we say control, we do not mean the control case where control is obsessive or other determined, or where the individual is controlling things out of compulsion or fear. We simply mean willingness to start, stop, and change. The anatomy of control is just that, starting, stopping, and changing things. Now, it is not necessary for a person to start, stop, and change things just to demonstrate that he can control them. He must, however, to be healthy and capable, be able to start, stop, and change things. Here we come immediately to what we mean by ability. It would be the ability to start, change, and stop things. And if we have an ability to start, stop, and change things, we of course must have a willingness to start, stop, and change things. Those people who are unwillingly behaving in some direction so as to start, stop, and change things are very sick people. And in this category, this last category, we discover the bulk of the human race at this writing. The basic difference between aberration and sanity, between inability and ability, between illness and health, is the knowingness of causation by self, opposed to unknown causation by others or other things. An individual who knows he is doing it is far more capable than one who is doing it but supposes something else is doing it. Psychosis is itself simply an inversion of determinism. A psychotic is entirely other-determined. A sane man is, in good measure, self-determined. Pandeterminism would mean a willingness to start, change, and stop on any and all dynamics. That is its primary definition. A further definition, also a precision definition, is the willingness to start, change, and stop two or more forces, whether or not opposed. And this could be interpreted as two or more individuals, two or more groups, two or more planets, two or more life species, two or more universes, two or more spirits, whether or not opposed. This means that one would not necessarily fight, he would not necessarily choose sides. This is in total controversy to some of the most cherished beliefs of man. But may I point out to you quickly that man is not an entirely sane person, and thus some of his beliefs must be somewhat aberrated. There is such a thing as courage, but there is not such a thing as sanity totally opposed. People who are afraid of control are liable to be afraid of pandeterminism. But if they will see this as a willingness to start, change, and stop any dynamic, they will see that a person must be assuming the responsibility for any of the dynamics. A conqueror in his onslaught against society is fighting other determinisms. He is starting, changing, and stopping things because of an unwillingness to associate with or support other races or customs than his own. Therefore, what he is doing can be interpreted as bad. In support of this, we get all of the earlier religious teachings. But these have been grossly misinterpreted. These have been interpreted to mean that a person should not fight in any way or defend anything or have anything or own anything. This is not true. A person who is willing to be other individualities besides himself does not necessarily harm these other individualities. Indeed, we cannot make the complete distinction of other than himself, since we are saying in this that he clings to something he calls self and supports and defends it without being willing to identify himself with others. One of the most maddening debaters is one who moves at will between the viewpoints of himself and those who have elected him as an enemy. There is an important scale down from pandeterminism. It does not lead along a dwindling dynamic path, but it could, of course. One could simply see, as pandeterminism dwindling, the falling off of one dynamic after another until one is down to first dynamic. But that is not a particularly workable picture, and an auditor does not use it. The scale down from pandeterminism is pandeterminism, fighting, must and must not happen again, repair, association. These are actually processes. At the bottom we find an unwillingness to associate with anything. Just above this is an unwillingness to repair anything, but a willingness to associate somewhat. Above this is a willingness to associate and to repair somewhat, but no willingness to let certain things happen again. Above this is a willingness to fight things, and above this is pandeterminism. These are arranged in this fashion because this is the ladder a pre-clear climbs if he is run on a certain type of process. This is something like the old emotional scale, which went apathy, grief, fear, anger, antagonism, boredom, conservatism, and enthusiasm, only in this case it is a scale of behavior manifestations. Where an individual who is unwilling to associate with various things is certainly a long way from being pan-determined and definitely is not even self-determined, he has to come up a ways before he is willing to repair anything. But in this frame of mind, he can repair quite generally, but is unwilling or unable to create or destroy. An oddity here is that a person who is unwilling to associate is only able to destroy, and a person has to be very far up this scale before he can create. In fact, he has to be up around pan-determinism to adequately create. Above this level of repair, we find an individual frozen in many incidents, which he is preventing from occurring once more, and is holding the facsimiles or engrams of these incidents so that he will have a model and so know what mustn't occur. And above this level, we discover an individual fighting or being willing to fight almost anything. And above this level, we discover an individual pan-determined, willing or able to be almost anything, and so may be at peace with things and does not have to fight things. An individual at a pan-determinism level can create. An individual at association, as I have said, can only destroy. An individual at repair and mustn't happen again is making a very heavy effort, and I do mean effort, to survive. Let us take for our example of pan-determinism the second dynamic. Here we find such a thorough effort to have other determinism that Freud picked this out as the only aberrative factor. It is not the only aberrative factor, but in view of the fact that it is a desired inflow, it can be considered, with many other things, to have some aberrative value. Let us look at it from terms of self-determinism and pan-determinism. Here we have an individual believing himself to be a man who believes that his only sexual pleasure can be derived from remaining very solidly a man and having sexual relationships with a woman and being very sure that he is not the woman. On the other hand, we find the woman determined to be herself and experience as herself and to experience a sexual inflow from a man. In the case of the man, as in the case of the woman, we have an unwillingness to be the other sex. This is considered natural, but do you know that when this is entirely true, when we have complete determinism to be self and not to be to any slightest degree the other person, there is no sexual pleasure interchange of any kind whatsoever? We get the condition known as satyrism and nymphomania. We get a tremendous anxiety to have a sexual flow. Probably the only reason you can see the universe at all is because you are still willing to be some part of it. Probably the only reason you can talk to people is because you can also be the other person you are talking to. Probably the only reason you can really let people talk to you is because you are willing to let the other person be you somewhat, and he is willing to let you be him to some degree. In view of the fact that space itself is a mock-up, is a state of mind, it can be seen that individuality depends to some degree upon the law that no two things must occupy the same space. When we get this law in action, we have a universe. Until this law goes into action, there is no universe, and one would be hard put to differentiate entirely. Two things can occupy the same space to the degree that you are willing to believe they can. It is a very easy thing to talk to an audience if you are perfectly willing to be an audience. It is a very difficult thing to talk to an audience if you are unwilling to be the audience. Similarly, it is very difficult to be an audience if you are unwilling to be on the stage. One could conceive that a person who had a considerable amount of stage fright would be incapable of enjoying the performance of actors. And so it is. We discover the person who is in the audience and has himself considerable stage fright, writhing and feeling embarrassed for every actor who makes the slightest slip or mistake. In other words, we find this person compulsively being on the stage, although he is in the audience. Things of this nature have led more than one philosopher to assume that we were all from the same mold, or that we were all the same thing. This is a very moot question. Processing demonstrates rather adequately that we are all really individuals, and that we are not the same individual. And indeed, people who believe we are all the same individual have a very rough time of it. But evidently, we could all be the same individual, at least if we were entirely sane. The physical universe is a sort of a hypnotic trance, where the individual believes himself to be capable of viewing from various points. The illusion is rendered very excellent by the fact that other individuals believe that they are viewing the same things from the same points as they occupy. We are all, as awareness of awareness units, basically different. We are not the same pool of life, and we are all, evidently, differently endowed, no matter what the Communist Party would like to believe. One of the most significant differences from man to man is the degree to which he is willing to be pan-determined. The man who has to forcefully control everything in his vicinity, including his family, is not being self-determined, usually, much less pan-determined. He is not being his family. If he were being his family, he would understand why they were doing what they were doing, and he would not feel that there was any danger or menace in their going on, executing the motions or emanating the emotions which they do. But anchored down as one person, rather obsessed with the damage that can be done to him or those around him, an individual is apt to launch himself upon a course of heavy, solid super-control of others. Now let us take the person who is self-determined and pan-determined in the same situation. And we discover that he would have enough understanding in the vicinity of his family, and with this understanding would be willing to be and experience as the remainder of the family. And we would find out that he actually could control the family with considerable ease. The oddity of it is that force can only control down into n-theta, to enturbulation, but that a pan-determinism controls upward into greater happiness and understanding, since there is more ARC present. You have seen individuals around whom a great deal of peace and quiet obtained. Such individuals quite commonly hold into sanity and cheerfulness many others in their environment who are not basically stable or self-determined at all. The individual who is doing this is not doing it out of obsession. He is doing it simply by knowing and being. He understands what people are talking about because he is perfectly willing to be these people. When he falls away from understanding what they are talking about, he has also fallen away from being willing to be them. Willingness to understand and willingness to be are, for our purposes, synonymous. Now, how does this pan-determinism tie into communication? We have seen that difficulties arose on the cycle of communication and on the two-way cycle of communication when origins of communication, answers, and acknowledgments were scarce. This must be then that the individual, becoming aberrated through communication, must have conceived the necessity of an other determinism. In other words, one has to fall away from pan-determinism to get into any of the traps of communication at all. It is a very fortunate thing for us that pan-determinism exists. Otherwise, there would be absolutely no way whatsoever out of this maze of miscommunications that a person gets into. The only way out of it would be to have other people come around and do enough talking and go to enough movies and seek out another self-determinism which would communicate and make it communicate until one was sane. However, it doesn't happen to work out in an unlimited sense in this way. The oddity is that it works out in mock-up processing. Further, it works out best in mock-up, for in mock-up we introduce the idea of pan-determinism. When we ask somebody to get the idea that somebody else is present who is not, and then have him make this person give him answers, we discover after a while that some major aberrations have blown out of our pre-clear. In the first part, the pre-clear is actually remedying the scarcity of answers, or if these were being processed, origins or acknowledgments, and is so disentangling communication lines. The sense of what he would mock the person up as saying would have nothing to do with it. The communication could be almost pure gibberish as long as it was an answer. This would straighten out the bank to a very marked degree. The other factor which enters into this is pan-determinism. We are making the individual actually mock up somebody else and make somebody else say something. In other words, we are making our pre-clear take over the control, the start, change, and stop of another communication medium. And with further test and experiment, we discover that we can do this for all the dynamics. And when we have done it for all the dynamics, we have brought our pre-clear up to a point of where he is willing to monitor communications on all the dynamics. And when he is willing to do this and get origins, answers, and acknowledgments along all the dynamics, we find that we have a very serene person who can do the most remarkable things. Anything you have read about concerning the potential abilities of the clear and a lot more come true when we follow this course. So it is a very fortunate thing for us that pan-determinism exists. Otherwise, there would be no processing anybody. Remember when you are explaining this to people that it is willingness to control on any and all dynamics, and that it is not obsessive or compulsive control to own, protect, or hide on any dynamic. All the ills of earth come from an obsession to own, control, protect, and hide on other dynamics than self. The true enlightenments of this world have come from willingness to be along any of the dynamics. One of the things which gives truth to pan-determinism is the savageness with which the aberrated attempt to drive an individual away from anything resembling pan-determinism. This is simply an obsessive action on the part of people to climb up to pan-determinism by force. Pan-determinism cannot be climbed by force. The ladder to that height is not made of pikes and spears, spankings and police forces. It is made of understanding, affinity, reality, and communication. Chapter 12. The 6 Basic Processes. Today's auditor must be conversant with 6 basic processes and must be able to get results with these processes before he can expect to get results with higher levels of auditing. These 6 processes form a roadway for more than the auditor. We discover that they compose a tone scale. See Chart of Processes in the audiobook directory. This tone scale is as follows. At its lowest and highest reaches, whether by mimicry, words, or mock-up, we have two-way communication. Next above this, occupying the position from about 1.1 to 1.8, we have elementary straight wire. Above this, from 1.8 to 2.5, we have opening procedure of 8C. Above this, from 2.6 to 3.0, we have opening procedure by duplication. Above this, from 3.1 to 3.5, we have remedy of havingness. And above this, from 3.6 to 4.0, we have spotting spots in space. An auditor, in auditing these 6 basic processes, becomes sufficiently capable in observing and communicating that he can handle or can bring the pre-clear up to the point where he can handle the subjective process which remedies communication, or the other one, which is the one-shot clear. The problem of psychosis never rightly belonged in Dianetics, but it has been solved there. Opening procedure of 8C and the mimicry techniques, as given in the professional auditors' bulletins, resolve psychosis. They resolve it rapidly and care for it adequately, and we have no real worry on that score. The only reason we would enter the field of psychosis at all would be to find out how far south our techniques worked. These 6 basic processes also resolve psychosomatic illness and do other remarkable things. As covered much more fully in The Creation of Human Ability, these 6 basic processes form the background to all processes. Through them, we find two-way communication everywhere. It can be said with honesty that there is no auditing without two-way communication. Two-way communication. The process two-way communication itself could be subdivided into verbal and non-verbal processes. The verbal processes would include questions about the present time environment and the pre-clear's life, interests, and so forth, and would get a direct answer to every question, no matter how long the communication lag was. In other words, a two-way communication would be entered upon so as to actually bring the pre-clear to talk to the auditor. In the case of people who have great difficulties in this line, we have nonverbal techniques, such as mimicry, wherein the auditor mimics the pre-clear and persuades the pre-clear to mimic the auditor. Various processes are used, such as passing a ball back and forth between them, nodding, shaking hands, sitting down, standing up, walking across the room and back, and sitting down, all of which are effective. Much of this book, Dianetics 55, is on the subject of two-way communication, and the totality of auditing is bringing a pre-clear into excellent two-way communication. And it is conceived a little difficult by instructors to relay the process called two-way communication. However, it is actually simplicity itself, for all that is necessary is to get the pre-clear to actually volunteer communications and answer the communications volunteered to him. There is always something the pre-clear will talk about. Mimicry, particularly when used on psychotics, is a precision subject. Mimicry is not a new process. It is almost as old as psychotherapy, but it is spotty when used without an intimate knowledge of validation. It can be said that which one validates comes true. The only force or strength life has is that which derives directly from the upper echelon of understanding. When life gets down to a point where it is incomprehensible, it cannot relay any understanding. Understanding this is essential for an auditor. He must realize that he gives power to everything he validates. We made something important out of the engram, and by validating engrams we actually, where they were audited poorly, gave force and power to engrams. Thus it is with the psychotic. To mimic the strange, peculiar, bizarre, and unusual things he does is to give force and strength to those things. It cannot be said with sufficient emphasis that the auditor must never mimic the strange, bizarre, and unusual manifestations of the psychotic. The only way that the auditor can make mimicry work, consistently and continually and rapidly, is by validating what the environment considers the agreed upon, the usual, the routine, the ordinary. Perhaps a psychotic is twisting his hands madly and occasionally nodding slightly. The auditor, in mimicking him, would not twist his hands but would nod slightly, since a nod is the agreed-upon manifestation in the environment, not the twisting of hands. If the auditor does this, the pre-clear will begin to nod more and twist his hands less. If the auditor were to begin to mimic the psychotic by twisting hands, he would discover that the psychotic would probably stop twisting his hands but would do something else much more bizarre. And if the auditor then mimicked this much more bizarre thing, the psychotic would simply go on to something even wilder or might become entirely motionless. For the one fear the psychotic has is becoming predictable. The psychotic is under the control of entities, demon circuits. He does have a grain of sanity present, otherwise he would not be able to function at all. Therefore, those things that he does which are sane must be mimicked and so reinforced. If an auditor knows this thoroughly and practices it smartly, he will discover that psychotics can be brought into two-way communication and moved immediately into opening procedure of 8C. the proper process on psychotics. 8C, while not a psychotic process, does work on psychotics. However, in working opening procedure of 8C on the psychotic, the auditor must be very careful not to go beyond Part A for a long, long time. Elementary straight wire. From the process known as two-way communication, we move on to the process known as elementary straight wire. Elementary straight wire has two basic commands. One of these commands is used continually over and over and over and over until the communication lag is entirely flat on it. Then the other command is used over and over and over until the communication lag is entirely flat, at which time it will be discovered that the first command will now give communication lags, and so it is used over and over and over. And then the second one is used over and over and over. In other words, what we do here is to use this process of elementary straight wire with just two commands continually, one command at a time, flattening each communication lag encountered. While doing this, of course, one maintains a two-way communication. He acknowledges the fact that the pre-clear has recalled something and is, in general, alert to receive from the pre-clear an originated communication, answer it, and give further orders. The two commands of elementary straight wire are, give me something you wouldn't mind remembering. Give me something you wouldn't mind forgetting. This can be varied with, tell me something you wouldn't mind remembering. Tell me something you wouldn't mind forgetting. This elementary straight wire is a standard form. If it is varied, it should be varied toward simplicity. A simple form of straight wire is, remember something, over and over, again and again, and again and again and again. Do not use, however, forget something, since this is far too rough for the pre-clear. Another even simpler form is to apply remember something to the dynamics, such as remember a man, remember a group. The only error that can be made in elementary straight wire is to get too fancy, for one does not believe that an auditor who has advanced this far in auditing would make an error in communication. There is an entire gamut which we call the next to the last list in self-analysis, published in self-analysis, which has many times been known to break a person from a neurotic to a sane state. This is, can you recall a time that is really real to you? Can you recall a time when you were communicating well to someone? Can you recall a time when someone was communicating well to you? Can you recall a time when you felt affinity for someone? Can you recall a time when someone felt affinity for you? By keeping this in the understanding or affinity line, a case advances more rapidly than if misemotion and other factors are addressed. Opening procedure of 8C. Opening procedure of 8C is one of the most effective and powerful processes ever developed and should be recognized and used as such. The main error which is made with the opening procedure of 8C is not to do it long enough. It takes about 15 hours of opening procedure of 8C in order to bring a person into a completely relaxed and self-determined state of mind regarding orders. Opening procedure 8C is a precision process. Part A of opening procedure of 8C is, do you see that object? The auditor pointing. When the pre-clear signifies that he does, the auditor says, walk over to it. When the pre-clear has walked over to it, the auditor says, touch it. When the pre-clear does, the auditor says, let go, and designates another object, a wall, a lamp, calls them by name or not, and goes through the same procedure once more. It is important that the auditor specifically acknowledge each time the pre-clear has executed the command given. When the pre-clear has seen the object, when he has walked over to it, when he has touched it, when he has let it go, each time, the auditor signifies that he has perceived and does acknowledge this action on the part of the pre-clear. This step, A, is used until the pre-clear does it easily, smoothly, without the slightest variation or introduction of any physical communication lag, and has demonstrated completely that he has no upset feeling about the auditor or objects in the room. When A has been run for a length of time necessary to bring the case up tone, Part B is run. Part B introduces the idea of decision. It is notable that the one-shot clear must be very strong on this power of decision. It is also notable that a person in extremely bad condition has no power of decision. The commands of Part B are, pick a spot in this room, and when the pre-clear has, walk over to it. And when the pre-clear does, put your finger on it. And when the pre-clear has, let go. Each time, the auditor acknowledges the completion of the command by the pre-clear, signifying all right or okay or fine, making it very plain that he has noticed and approves of and is acknowledging the action of the pre-clear in following each specific command. He approves of these one at a time in this fashion. The pre-clear is run on this until he demonstrates no physical communication lag of any kind in making up his mind what to touch, how to touch it, and so forth. Part C of Opening Procedure of 8C introduces further decision. It goes as follows. The auditor says, pick a spot in this room. And when the pre-clear has, the auditor says, walk over to it. When the pre-clear does, the auditor says, make up your mind when you are going to place your finger on it and do so. When the pre-clear has done this, the auditor says, make up your mind when you are going to let go and let go. The auditor each time acknowledges the completion of one of these orders to the pre-clear. In doing Opening Procedure of 8C, the pre-clear must not be permitted to execute a command before it is given, and a two-way communication must be maintained. As I have said, Opening Procedure of 8C is a very powerful process. If all auditors knew was how to do Opening Procedure 8C and could do this very well, we would right there have psychotherapy licked. But we are not trying to lick psychotherapy. It has never been a major problem to us. We are trying to bring people a long way further north than psychotherapy ever dreamed of. And Dianetics and Scientology are not psychotherapies. They are processes which increase the abilities of people. Opening Procedure by Duplication. Opening procedure by duplication has as its goal the separating of time, moment from moment. This is done by getting a pre-clear to duplicate his same action over and over again with two dissimilar objects. In England, this process is called book and bottle, probably because these two familiar objects are the most used in doing opening procedure by duplication. The first step of opening procedure by duplication is to familiarize the pre-clear with both objects as to their reality and his ability to own them. One makes him handle them and feel them and acquaint himself with them, makes him describe them as objects he is experiencing in present time, not as something related into the past. A little time spent on this can be quite beneficial. The auditor then begins what will become to the pre-clear, before he is through with this, some of the most hated phrases anyone could conceive, but which, by the time the pre-clear is finished with this, become just like any other phrases. Many people believe that opening procedure by duplication induces hypnosis. This is because in running it, hypnotism runs off. The pre-clear, while the hypnotism is running off, may feel quite hypnotized. It is the exact reverse of hypnotism. Hypnotism is an effort to persuade the individual to do nothing, to sit still, and to accept fully the inflow. Opening procedure by duplication contains two-way communication, and indeed does not work unless two-way communication is done with it. The main liability in doing two-way communication on opening procedure by duplication is that the auditor, in introducing two-way communication to it, may stray considerably from the pattern laid down. He must not do this. Although he is maintaining two-way communication, he must adhere very sharply to the process. He can make the pre-clear tell more about them. He can make the pre-clear describe various things which are manifesting themselves to the pre-clear. He can be insistent the pre-clear really knows he has just picked this up. But he must stay with this sequence of auditing commands and may not vary from them even vaguely. He can interject other conversation, but not other auditing commands into opening procedure by duplication. The auditing commands are, "Do you see that book?" says the auditor, pointing. When the pre-clear signifies that he has, the auditor says, "Walk over to it." When the pre-clear does, the auditor says, "Pick it up." When the pre-clear does, the auditor says, "Look at it." When the pre-clear does, usually he was looking at it but now looks at it more closely, the auditor says, "Give me its color." When the pre-clear does, the auditor says, "Give me its weight." When the pre-clear does, the auditor says, "Give me its temperature." When the pre-clear has, the auditor says, "Put it back exactly as you found it." This action sequence having been completed, the auditor points to the bottle. "Do you see that bottle?" When the pre-clear does, the auditor says, walk over to it. When the pre-clear does, the auditor says, pick it up. When the pre-clear has, the auditor says, look at it. When the pre-clear does, the auditor says, give me its color. When the pre-clear has, the auditor says, give me its weight. When the pre-clear has, the auditor says, give me its temperature. When the pre-clear has, the auditor says, put it back exactly as you found it. Then the auditor says, pointing at the book, do you see that book? And so on, back and forth, using this exact sequence of commands. The auditor can interject, describe it more fully. The auditor can sometimes, but not more often than once every 15 minutes, point to the book, have the pre-clear go through the full sequence with the book, and then point to the book again and have the pre-clear once more go through the full sequence with the book. This will break down the automatic machinery a pre-clear is bound to set up to compensate for this process. We want to keep the pre-clear doing it, not his machines. By asking the pre-clear to describe the object or describe its temperature more fully, in its proper sequence in these commands, machines are also broken down and the alertness and awareness of the pre-clear is increased. The auditor must not omit letting the pre-clear give him the pre-clear's reactions. The pre-clear will pause, seem to be confused. It is up to the auditor at that moment to say, what happened, and to find out what happened, and then to continue with the process, having acknowledged the communication of the pre-clear. An auditor must never be afraid to let a pre-clear emanate a communication, and an auditor must never fail to acknowledge the completion of an auditing action, no matter how minute. Remedy of havingness. The remedy of havingness is an extremely effective process, for it remedies the ability of the pre-clear to have or not have at will. Sometimes auditors interpret this process as inflow only. That is because the physical universe is an inflow universe, and it is all too easy for an auditor to assign to auditing and all other actions inflow characteristics only. The modus operandi of the remedy of havingness is to have the pre-clear mock up something, pull it in, or mock up something and throw it away. It does not matter what you have him mock up. The item can have significance or not, as the case may be. Pre-clears who are low in tone, if this is run on them, and it should not be, have a tendency to make everything they mock up very significant. It is not the significance, it is the mass which counts. However, to keep the pre-clear interested or to assist his mocking up, an auditor may designate specific things, and does so. It will be found that the acceptance level and expectance level of the pre-clear very definitely monitor what he mocks up, and what he can pull in and what he can throw away. As covered in the Professional Auditor's Bulletins, acceptance level processes can be combined with remedy of havingness. The commands of remedy of havingness are as follows. Mock up a planet, man, brick. Make a copy of it. Make a copy of it. Make a copy of it. And when the pre-clear has from 5 to 15 copies, push them all together. Now pull them in on you. When the pre-clear has done this for some time, the last command is varied by saying, throw them away and have them disappear in the distance. In other words, we have the pre-clear mock up something. When he has, we have him make a copy of it, make another copy and another copy and another copy, one at a time, push them together and pull them in or throw them away. We keep up this process for some time until we are very certain that he can actually throw things away or pull them in on himself at will. This is the remedy of havingness. Remedy of havingness does not mean stuffing the pre-clear with energy. It means remedying his ability to have or not have energy. Run with particular significances, such as money, women, etc., one could remedy specific scarcities on the part of the pre-clear. But remember, they may be so scarce at first that he will have to waste a large quantity of them before he can have one. On an awareness of awareness unit exteriorized, we run remedy of havingness a little differently. We say, put up 8 anchor points. We describe to him how we want these put up. We want them put up in such a way as to form the corners of a cube. In other words, these 8 anchor points are not to be in a group in front or behind the pre-clear, but they are to be distributed around him. When the pre-clear has done this, we say, pull them into you. We keep this up for a long time. We also have the pre-clear exteriorized, mock up 8 anchor points and send them away from him. A pre-clear exteriorized can be very unhappy about his lack of havingness, and this last process is used to remedy this upset. Remedy of havingness is an exteriorization technique. If it is run on an individual long enough, say 8 or 10 hours, he will probably exteriorize at the end of that time. If you kept on running it as an exteriorized process, given in the second part above, he would then have his visio clear up and he would finally get into very excellent condition. This is quite a process. However, remember this process depends upon the pre-clear following the auditor's orders. Unless the auditor has guaranteed this by opening procedure of 8C and opening procedure by duplication, the chances of the pre-clear actually following his orders, although pretending to do so, are very slim. We have discovered in old-time Dianetics that the breakdown was in the failure of the pre-clear to follow the auditor's orders. Pre-clears would pretend to follow an auditor's orders, but actually would not. Spotting spots in space. The process known as spotting spots in space is not to be attempted on somebody who is having a difficult time, and when it is attempted, it should be accompanied with remedy of havingness. One makes a person spot spots in space for a short time, then remedy havingness, then spot spots in space, then remedy havingness, then spot spots in space. These two processes, remedy of havingness and spotting spots in space, actually belong together. However, the pre-clear eventually emerges up into a higher band where he can spot spots in space without remedying his havingness. The auditing commands are, spot a spot in the space of this room. When the pre-clear has, the auditor says, spot another spot, etc. When the pre-clear gets well into the process in this fashion, we say, spot a spot in the space of this room. Walk over to it. When he has, put your finger on it. When he does, let go. The auditor should ask a pre-clear when he starts this process if the spot has any mass, color, temperature, or any other characteristic, or how big is it? The auditor asks this to make sure this pre-clear is actually spotting a spot, a simple location, not a spot that has mass or temperature or characteristics. A location is simply a location. It does not have mass. It does not have color. It does not have temperature. When we ask the pre-clear to spot a spot, at first his spots are liable to have mass and temperature. We do not object to this. We simply ask him frequently, once we have discovered that his spots do have this, how his spots are getting along. And we remember on such a pre-clear that we must remedy havingness. Eventually, he will move out to a point where he is simply spotting locations. Use of 6 basic processes. These are the 6 basic processes that an auditor must know. They are, all of them, very powerful processes, and each and any one of them can accomplish the goals which were envisioned in Dianetics, the modern science of mental health. The essence of these processes is to do them as given, to do them purely, all the while maintaining a two-way communication with the pre-clear. Auditors get into minor variations on this set of processes, but these processes were evolved first from theory by myself, were developed in practice by myself, and were then given to many auditors to do, and many auditors were trained in them. And then these processes were refined and inspected and refined and inspected until they represent a very broad agreement. And we have found that these commands, as you have them here, are the best commands which can be used in processing a pre-clear. The failure of an auditor to duplicate, his unwillingness to duplicate, his upset about duplication in general, will quite often lead him up the blind alley of varying a process compulsively or obsessively. When he does, he can expect to lessen the results. Auditing today, by the experience of a very large number of auditors, is a very severe discipline on the individual. It is not an art, and it never will be an art. It is a precision science. In the old days, all this talk about art and intuition and instinctiveness cost a lot of pre-clears the benefit of auditing. Auditing in the long ago was tremendously complicated, but it was nonetheless precise. Now that it is very simple, it is still very precise. Amongst these processes, an understanding of communication lag and opening procedure of 8C were chosen as the 2 processes to be taught to a very large area which contained a large number of auditors. This area had been noteworthy heretofore for the strange results obtained by auditors and the strange techniques which were used in it. A couple of auditors were sent into this area to teach everybody communication lag and opening procedure of 8C. Actually, these two auditors were originally from this area. They did so, and several lives have been reported saved to date, and a great many cases have been salvaged, and the entire science is looking up in that particular area simply because the area was taught nothing but communication lag and the opening procedure of 8C and did nothing thereafter but this. Out in the outskirts of this area, a couple of auditors varied opening procedure by duplication and were reported to be having very good luck with the variation. But these two auditors were not part of the crew who were taught opening procedure of 8C and communication lag, and the results they were obtaining were very junior to the results being obtained by their own fellows very close by. It could be said that the only real danger in auditing was failure. Auditing is the start, change, and stop of aberration, or the creation of ability. Today, creation of ability takes prominence to a point where aberration drops out of sight and is forgotten. But the auditor who does not obtain results is demonstrating to himself that he cannot control human aberration and human ability, and the demonstration of his failure to himself is sufficient to make him slightly incapable in handling his own difficulties. Thus, it is a tremendously important thing that we have processes which, when used exactly as given and used with skill, produce uniformly good results on pre-clears. An auditor using these on pre-clears gets better and better and better and better, even when he doesn't have any auditing himself, a thing which was not the story of 1950. When you can control aberration in others, when you can increase the ability of others, you certainly do not worry about your own. An auditor who has consistent failures will eventually drop back to self-auditing, but these processes will cure even that. Self-auditing, of course, is the manifestation of going around running concepts or processes on one's self. One is doing this because he has been made afraid, through his failure on others, of his ability to control his own engrams, facsimiles, thoughts, and concepts. And he seeks to control them through auditing. It is not necessary for an individual to audit himself in order to control his own machinery. Before anyone should adventure in the direction of testing the one-shot clear or doing anything about exteriorizing the awareness of awareness unit and so making a clear, he should be entirely conversant with these processes. Actually, any of these processes run long enough would probably result in an exteriorization. There are faster ways to achieve an exteriorization than these processes, but these processes are preliminary to that. The pre-clear who cannot follow the auditor's orders will not sit there and do a subjective, which is to say an out-of-sight in his own mind, process without varying it. The trouble with the pre-clear is that he cannot duplicate. He cannot follow the orders of the auditor. And when the auditor tells him to run a concept or a thought, the pre-clear probably pays token nod to this and runs entirely something else. A very close e-meter review of a number of pre-clears who were not advancing under subjective processes disclosed that each and every one of them had never run what the auditor told them to run. They were afraid of obeying the auditor. They were afraid of what the auditor was doing. They were afraid of his skill. Opening procedure of 8C remedies this fear and brings the inability and unwillingness of the pre-clear out into the open where it belongs. In opening procedure by duplication, we very often get a pre-clear blowing the session, where the auditor has run an insufficient quantity of opening procedure of 8C. When a pre-clear blows a session on opening procedure by duplication, the auditor has missed. He has not run enough opening procedure of 8C. How much is enough opening procedure of 8C? Until the person is in very good condition as Homo sapiens. Remember that whether the command is physical or mental, the auditor must observe communication lag. In opening procedure of 8C, he simply repeats the process commands all the way through, and then again and again and again, and in such a way flattens any lag which shows up. He does not repeat the command on which the pre-clear got the lag. It is easier to do this way. It is a more orderly process when it is done this way. By very close theory, the actual command on which the pre-clear lagged should be repeated again, but this is not done. These are the 6 basic processes which we must know before we can constitute ourselves auditors today. These are the processes which are getting results. These are the processes which are making able men and able women. These processes can be varied into specific uses where ability is concerned. One of the uses of these, for instance, would be to raise the ability of a pilot to fly a plane or a person to drive a car simply by having him approach, touch, and let go of various parts of the object to be controlled. The exact procedure, as given above of opening procedure of 8C, is run, except that the object to be controlled is used. Typists have learned to type better, people have learned to drive cars better, and many other abilities have been recovered simply by running 8C. One could envision a pianist who was getting tired, run down, or upset by his music, coming into full awareness of it once more simply by running 8C on his instrument or instruments. If we wanted to increase the ability of a salesman, it would only be necessary to run any of the above processes in their proper position on the tone scale to increase his ability. Abilities increase in general when these are run. When does one run what process? One should have a copy of the chart of human evaluation from Science of Survival and know that chart well in order to understand exactly where one starts. In general practice, however, an auditor simply starts with two-way communication, and when he is getting answers to his questions and is talking rather freely with his preclear, he goes into elementary straight wire. And from elementary straight wire, he goes into opening procedure of 8C. There is a variation on two-way communication. If you have a difficulty in getting a preclear started in two-way communication, it is a very easy thing to get him talking about problems, and from problems to run this one. What problem could you be to yourself? What problem could you be to others, running one and then the other each time until the preclear understood he could be an infinity of problems? Many people are so thoroughly scarce on problems that they will not let any go until they know that they can create problems for themselves. When a case is stalling, he is generally finding it very hard to give up a pet problem because he knows he can't have any more. Of course, all this is basically situated on answers. He can't have any answers, so he has to have problems. Then from problems, he finally gets to a point where he can't even have these. Anyone desiring to be a good auditor should follow this chapter very closely, should provide himself with a copy of The Creation of Human Ability, and should also procure Science of Survival and study them. The best way to become an auditor is to be trained as an auditor. We have found this so much the case that while we still offer an examination to anyone who wishes to take it, to the grade of Hubbard Certified Auditor or Hubbard Dianetic Auditor, we never expect them to pass it, for they never have, even though it is on the most simple elements as you see before you. There is no substitute for good training. Chapter 13. The Processing of Communication. If you will examine the 6 basic processes, you will discover that they are communication processes. The efficacy of opening procedure of 8C derives from the fact that it places into the realm of knowingness communication with the physical universe. The physical universe does not give us back answers, but the opening procedure of 8C remedies to a marked degree the liability of this no-answer situation by making the individual aware of the fact that walls are simply walls, that chairs are chairs, and floors floors, and ceilings ceilings. Opening procedure by duplication is processing another facet of communications, terminals, the object, terminal at cause, interchanging flow with the object, terminal at effect. Elementary straight wire is simply a communication with the past and securing of answers from the past. In other words, using the past as a terminal. Havingness in itself describes the mass at a terminal, or masses. And spotting spots in space improves the tolerance of an absence of a communication terminal. These 6 basic processes, as designed, bring an individual up a gradient scale of tolerance for more and more communication. Once a preclear has been pressed through these, he is ready for the direct processing of communication. He is not ready for the direct processing of communication until he has been put through these 6 basic processes. The ability of an individual depends upon his ability to communicate. The first and foremost of mechanical abilities is this communication ability. An individual who cannot communicate with something will become the victim of that something. That which a person withdraws from in this universe becomes, to a marked degree, his master. That which one fears becomes one's master. If an individual were willing to communicate with anything and everything in the entire universe, he would then be free in the entire universe. Additionally, he would have an unlimited supply of distances and terminals. A barrier, perforce, is something which an individual cannot communicate beyond. When we see space as a barrier, its total operation as a barrier is the inability of the individual to be at the other extreme end of that space or outside that space. When we see energy as a barrier, we simply see it as something which will not permit the egress or ingress of an individual. When we see mass, walls, or time as a barrier, we mean imagined impossibility of communication. If you do not imagine that you cannot communicate, then there cannot be a barrier. At the same time, we are placed up against this conundrum. In the absence of communication, in the absence of interchanges of communication, in the absence of other terminals, flows, and terminals to which others can communicate, an awareness of awareness unit is not, by its own consideration, living. Livingness is communication. Communication is livingness. We add to this the variant degrees of affinity. We add to it agreements and obtain reality. But still, these are only significances entered into communication. Any and all types of significances can be entered into communication in order to give a reason for communication. These reasons for are simply reasons for a game, reasons to have communication. In the light of the concept of pandeterminism, we see that an individual has to assume that he cannot know what another is talking about if he wishes to communicate with and depend upon the communications of that other. In other words, he has to pretend that he cannot communicate. An individual who has some sort of barrier around him must pretend that he cannot communicate beyond that barrier. Actually, this is nothing more nor less than a pretense. These barriers are the shadows through which the fish would not move. They could have swum through these shadows, except for the fact that they did not believe they could penetrate beyond the shadows. It could be said that belief alone is the reason for any entrapment. However, there are the mechanics of entrapment, and we discover that an entrapment must be a communication barrier. An individual becomes entrapped in something because he does not believe he can communicate outside of it, or he becomes fixated on a terminal as a terminal himself. To be very precise, the reason why an individual is entrapped has to do with scarcity of communication. An individual is still waiting, still looking toward something, expecting it to communicate to him. It has not, and he has eventually turned his attention slightly off of this onto something else which he expects to communicate to him. And when this does not, he expects communication and so finds it elsewhere. But each time he sets up one of these expectancy lines, he is to that tiny degree trapped against the terminal from which he was expecting, but did not get a communication. Thus we have the entire bundle known as the reactive mind, the entire anatomy of ridges, and any other interpolative mechanism, and even problems themselves, being a seemingly endless chain of communication scarcities. What are the specific scarcities in a communication line? There is no scarcity of silence. Anyone has far too much silence. Silence might be conceived to be the native state of a thetan, an awareness of awareness unit, but it is not. For obviously, a thetan is alive only to the degree that he is communicating his action, concentrated only to the degree that he is living. We discovered that the tiniest cells of the body consider themselves to be the very mirrors of truth when they are the most silent. There is an interesting and peculiar test here, where the auditor has the pre-clear mock-up in any area which contains a somatic, a great many answers or originated communications from these dead cells. And we discover this somatic-ridden area coming to life, waking up, becoming active once more. This in itself is a specific for all types of somatics. All one has to do is have the pre-clear mock-up answers in these dead cell areas. An ultimate truth, which is studied to a far greater extent in the creation of human ability, is a nothingness. But this ultimate truth is not life. Life is composed of this pretense that one cannot communicate, that one must communicate. It is composed of this intricate tangle of communications and self-erected barriers which give us a game. When we get too deeply immersed in this game, when answers get entirely too scarce, we forget that we were the ones who interposed the idea that no answers were to be given. Silences do not process. there is entirely too much silence on the track. Remember that. It does not process. You can fill silence, but silence itself is death. And when you process silence, you process the preclear down toward death, not upward toward life. The way to process him upward toward life is by supplying his scarcity of communication. We find the preclears who are in the worst condition are the preclears who are the most silent, the most out of communication. These are closest to death, closest to aberration. The way to get them alive again is to supply some of the scarcity of communication. Remedy of scarcity of communication. For a preclear who is in very poor shape, or in common practice any preclear you encounter, you would use first the 6 basic processes in order to bring the individual up to something approaching a livable communication stratum. And then you would go immediately into the remedy of scarcity of communication by having him mock up himself, even if just as ideas, the various parts of the two-way cycle of communication. The parts of a communication cycle which have to be remedied are 1. Originated communications. 2. People to communicate to, or other awareness of awareness units to communicate to. 3. Answers. 4. Acknowledgments. And additionally, but not as important, 5. Arrivals. 6. Departures. It is not necessary that the preclear have the ability to mock up or to put out and hear back sound. In other words, sonic and visio are not necessary to this process. The entirety necessary is the idea of communication. You might say you have him mock up a verbalizing idea. The preclear will sort through himself parts 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 if the preclear is simply told to mock up some people speaking. He will, in rotation, get people answering, people acknowledging, people greeting him, and people saying goodbye to him. Because the preclear is usually far down the tone scale on origin and ideas, and because necessity-level other determined forces have been necessary to get him into communication, it is likely that he will not himself spot the origination of communication, part 1, and the auditor will have to call his attention to this. Remember, this is not done on a preclear who has not first been put through his paces on the 6 basic processes. For an auditor sitting there, asking a preclear to mock up answers or acknowledgments or originated communications, could not otherwise be sure that the preclear is doing this at all. Further, the preclear's attention is very likely to stray into various portions of his own bank, for his bank starts to come to pieces under the impact of all of these communications. The preclear must be kept at his job. His mocking up of communications must be kept in a simplicity and out of deep significances. And if his attention seems to fixate upon flows and he begins to wrestle with mass, the auditor should get him back into mocking up communications as fast as possible. What degree of originality is required of the preclear in mocking up any of these originative communications, answers, or acknowledgments? The answer to this is none. No variety is necessary whatsoever. Simply the idea of communication with some sort of a specific idea being communicated is all that is necessary. Having a preclear silent himself, mock up before him something saying, hello, and saying hello again, and saying hello again. And then having him mock this up behind him, saying hello, and saying hello, and saying hello, and saying hello would be quite adequate for an originated communication. Having the preclear mock up any banality, such as all right or okay, serves very well for both answers and acknowledgments. We are not at all concerned with the significance of the communication. We do not want long and involved communications. The preclear will try to get off into them. He will also try to get into his prenatal bank, his early childhood and 8 lives ago. We do not want him to do this. We want him to go on mocking up originated communications, answers, acknowledgments. We are validating ability. We are not trying to get rid of inabilities in his past. We are trying to increase his ability to communicate in the present and originate communications and take a pandeterminism of all communicating terminals. We are not trying to get him to run out anything in the past. I know that an old Dianeticist is going to have a very hard time restraining himself from running out the prenatal which immediately appears after the preclear has made something say hello to him 15 or 20 times. It is the auditor's job today to make the pre-clear go on having the pre-clear or something say hello or okay or I did it, and to ignore that engram. The number of engrams which will blow into view and beg to be run are countless. The auditor is not interested in these. Of course, if the pre-clear wants to tell the auditor about these, the auditor must permit the pre-clear to originate the communication and must answer it, simply to get the pre-clear to originate communications. He should not let the pre-clear go on and on and on, discussing what has occurred, once the pre-clear has told him the essentials of it. The auditor wants to get the pre-clear back onto mocking up originating communications, answers, and acknowledgments. The auditor is also making the pre-clear mock up something to communicate to, number 2 above, while he is doing this, a point which is cared for automatically and which is not addressed actually and actively in auditing. Naturally, if there is a spot in the air out there saying hello or okay or I did it, the pre-clear is assuming that there is something alive there that can say hello to him. All manner of thinkingness machines, large black masses, white and green fire, purple spheres, falling stars, shooting rockets, may appear in the pre-clear's bank while he is undergoing this process. The auditor is not interested in this phenomenon. He is merely interested in getting the pre-clear to mock up further communications. It does not matter if the pre-clear says these communications himself aloud or simply does them quietly to himself. The necessity here is not sound. Sound is a byproduct of communication, is a carrier wave of communication, and is not itself communication. Some interesting variations can be worked on this. They are not advised, and indeed they violate the terms of this process, but they demonstrate how much power this process has. One has the pre-clear say aloud, "Okay, Mama," a few hundred times. He will be amazed at the amount of variation which will occur, the communication lags, the impatience, the anger, the amount of data which will jump up about Mama. But this data that is jumping up is simply the bank which is triggered to agree with what the pre-clear is doing at this moment. In other words, that is stimulus response. Restimulation is stimulus response, as is covered in great detail in Dianetics, the modern science of mental health. We could clear away an ally, we could do almost anything we wanted to do in Book 1 with this process of remedying the scarcity of communications. Another point immediately arises as to whether or not the havingness has to be remedied on the pre-clear. It has not been found necessary to remedy havingness on the pre-clear if one is actually remedying the scarcity of communication. This is a great oddity. For the pre-clear's bank, being composed of tangled and unfinished communication lines, starts to come apart the moment that you begin to remedy the scarcity of originated communications, answers, and acknowledgments. Some of these black masses, which the pre-clear has fondly held before his face, blow into forever. And yet the pre-clear does not need his mass remedied. The reason why he had to have mass was to compensate for the lack of communication. Where you have had a lack of communication, you are liable to have a mass. As an example of this, an individual loses an ally and then keeps close by him a ring which belonged to that ally. The ring is a substitute communication terminal for the ally. After a while, one begins to believe that he really has to have mass. He doesn't have to have mass at all. The remedy of the scarcity of communication cures a person of having to have mass, having to eat obsessively or do anything else obsessively. Along with the remedy of originated communications, the pre-clear's imagination rises quite markedly, and thus he is able to imagine new games and new ways of communication with sufficient rapidity to compensate for the old games which you are taking away from him. Actually, the pre-clear, being a pre-clear, is a game, perhaps even the last-ditch game in which the individual could engage. When the auditor has the pre-clear run acknowledgments, the wording is, "I did it." This will remedy responsibility difficulties. All automaticity comes about through lack of acknowledgments, absent players, secret players. In view of the fact that pandeterminism is control on all dynamics, and in view of the fact that control is start, change, and stop, one can have the pre-clear stop making things communicate for a moment, and then change the communication, and then start anew. This gives the pre-clear practice in starting, changing, and stopping. The auditing commands which would go with this are simply, mock up some answers. Mock up some original communications. Mock up some acknowledgments with enough guiding talk to give the pre-clear the idea that you do not want new, startling, difficult action, but only the simple placing of communication ideas, such as hello in the vicinity of the pre-clear, over and over and over and over. Exact auditing commands. The exact auditing commands to process communications are originated communications. Auditor. Have somebody out there, indicating a spot in the air, start saying hello to you. The pre-clear does so, is himself silent. When the process is long run, auditor, start saying hello to a live spot out there. The pre-clear aloud or as himself does so. Answers. Auditor, have a spot out there start saying okay to you. The pre-clear does this many times. Auditor, start saying okay to a spot out there. Acknowledgments. Auditor, have a spot out there start saying I did it. When the pre-clear has many times, auditor, start saying I did it to a spot out there. The command that turns on a somatic repeated often enough will turn it off. When in doubt, remedy havingness. This is the processing of communication directly. Remember that it is done after one has already done the 6 basic processes. Remember that a two-way communication is maintained with the pre-clear while it is being done. And remember that the pre-clear must be audited in full understanding and practice of the Auditor's Code 1954. If you do this, you will have clears. Chapter 14. The One-Shot Clear. The goal of the one-shot clear has been with us since the earliest days of Dianetics. By one-shot clear, we meant one phrase or one action given once or repeated which would bring into being the clear as described in Chapter 2 of Dianetics, the Modern Science of Mental Health. It should be understood by this time that the clear described in Dianetics, the Modern Science of Mental Health, is actually the thetan exterior of Scientology, the exteriorized awareness of awareness unit. In Scientology, the awareness of awareness unit is called a thetan, from the Greek symbol theta. The way to clear somebody is to get him out of the influence of his reactive bank and his analytical machinery. When a person is so cleared, his level of knowingness is sufficient to overcome the need of machinery and the need of stimulus response mechanisms as contained in his reactive mind. Long since, we have had a one-shot clear for 50% of the human race. All we say to the individual is, be 3 feet back of your head. If he is, he orients himself. He knows that he is not his body. He knows he does not have to be up against his reactive mind. He has been gotten out of the trap. Of course, there are many other things which you could do to further increase his ability and orient him in this position, but this is not immediately in our province in Dianetics. When an individual is so exteriorized, he also can look over the body and patch up pinched nerves, black areas, rearrange the anchor points which create and hold the space of the body, and so repair a body quite excellently. However, it is not the purpose of exteriorization simply to get a person to square away the machine known as a body. Be 3 feet back of your head is a strange and interesting combination of words. Evidently, this simple combination has not been known before by man. It is notable that one does not say, move 3 feet back of your head, since an awareness of awareness unit doesn't move, it appears and disappears from locations. If one uses this one-shot clear technique, he should be advised that he must not ask or expect of the newly exteriorized person a number of strange or impossible things. He must not ask him to go chasing around finding things. He must not ask him to prove that he is exteriorized. The individual says so. That's the end of it. In Scientology, of course, on Route 1, as contained in the Creation of Human Ability, we go on to improve the ability of this exteriorized awareness of awareness unit up to a point which we call operating thetan. We do this by running many drills and exercises which improve his perception. However, the process of answers, or even the 6 basic processes, can be run on the individual after he is exteriorized, and his exteriorization will markedly increase, and he will get into even better condition as an exteriorized person. If you were to say, be 3 feet back of your head to somebody, and he was, the next thing to do would be to go into elementary straight wire, then into opening procedure of 8C, then opening procedure by duplication, then remedy of havingness, then spotting spots in space, and then answers, or as the last chapter gives forth, remedy of scarcity of communication. If you did these things just as given in this book, you would have something like a stable clear. You would pay no attention to the fact that he was clear. As a matter of fact, if you were to run any of these 6 basic processes long enough, and certainly if you were to run answers for any length of time after you have run these 6 basic processes, you would have somebody exteriorized. It is a peculiar thing that there is no argument about exteriorization. Any argument which has been in existence was born out of the psychiatrist's observation of compulsive exteriorization by an individual who so detested his body that he stayed outside of it. Psychiatrists have been known to give people electric shocks and other treatments to get them to get back inside their body. This level of punishment, trying to get a person to accept something under duress, does not work. But then, nothing in psychiatry ever worked, except bank accounts. This compulsive exteriorization is a manifestation which we call, in Scientology, doing a bunk, in other words, running away. You will occasionally encounter this, but you will not encounter it if you run the 6 basic processes before you go in for exteriorization. There is, astonishingly enough, a 1-command clear for the remaining 50%, even if it has to be repeated many times. I have been developing and testing this for some time and have kept it back on the shelf against the time when we had enough competent auditors to use a process intelligently. This is a one-shot clear technique in that one uses 1 command and so achieves clearing. And after clearing to the stage of exteriorization has been accomplished, one simply goes on using the same type of command. It is a highly effective process, a very violent process. Theoretically, it would work on any level of case. In actual practice, psychotic, neurotic cases, or people badly out of communication, receive it with considerable difficulty, and it is not recommended for them. But it would work on them if it could be communicated to them. On such people, use opening procedure of 8C only. The basis for this process is the observation that the messed universe is a game. One can have a game and know it. He can be in a game and not know it. The difference is his determinism. Games require space and havingness. A game requires other players. Games also require skill and knowingness that they are games. Havingness is the need to have terminals and things to play for and on. When a game is done, the player keeps around tokens. These are hopes the game will start again. When that hope is dead, the token, the terminal, is hidden, and it becomes an automaticity, a game going on below the level of knowingness. Truthfully, one never stops playing a game once started. He plays old games in secret, even from himself, while playing or not playing new ones. The only real game one can have is in present time. All others are in the past or the future. Anxiety for a game takes one into the past. The command is, invent a game. And when the pre-clear has, again, invent a game. Then, have somebody else invent a game. Having established the fact that an auditing session is in progress, and established some slight communication with the pre-clear, the auditor says, invent a game. When the communication lag on this is flat, the auditor then uses the command, have somebody else invent a game. This is the only phrase he utters, but he of course engages in 2-way communication with the pre-clear when the pre-clear has something to say to him. An auditor has to be a good auditor in order to use this process. Just because it is a simple 1-command process is no reason why it will work for an auditor who is not cognizant with the auditor's code, cognizant of a 2-way communication, and hasn't some experience in more basic levels of processing. We use this process as a remedy for the scarcity of games, and we use it in full awareness of the processes involved in 2-way communication. It is a murderous process and requires 5 or 10 hours, in rough cases, to bring about an understanding of existence. This is not necessarily a recommended process. It is a workable process. It does function. It is fast. But remember that it has the frailty of the ability of the auditor himself. It has the frailty of failing when a 2-way communication is not maintained with the pre-clear. It will fail if the pre-clear in volunteering information finds no attention from the auditor. It will fail if the auditor does not acknowledge the fact that the pre-clear has done this. But if these things are considered, it will work. This process can be abused by the pre-clear. He can wander from it. He can sit there in the auditing chair doing other things. But we depend upon the skill of the auditor to see that the pre-clear is not doing other things and that he is actually doing the process. The pre-clear will pick his bank clean rather than invent. He will have doubts that he is inventing, but we persevere, and we win. Chapter 15. ARC Processing. If we examine communication, we will discover that all communication lag is the introduction of matter, energy, space, and time into communication. The more it has been introduced into communication, the less communication there is. As an example of this, let us say that a star in some other galaxy explodes, and then let us trace the length of time necessary for a small amount of that explosion's particles to reach Earth across great space. Almost countless light years elapse before this communication line has been completed. This is a very, very long communication, not necessarily a communication lag, since the progress of the particles is not interrupted. There are no vias. Actually, MEST itself does not have a communication lag. It is totally a communication lag. The more this sort of thing enters into communication, the worse off is the pre-clear. Thus we conceive the subject of MEST itself is the aberrative factor. As we examine barriers, we find that they are matter, energy, space, and time. We discover that we can overcome the barriers of matter. We can climb the walls or go through them. We can, somehow or other, brave or get on the other side of energy barriers. We discover that even space has limitations, even when it appears as limitless as the space of this universe. And the space of this universe appears as big as a person supposes it is big, whereas actually it is, to a Thetan who can get outside of it, about the size of a matchbox to a child. The one barrier which we could discover difficult to get around is time. The basic definitions and understanding of matter, energy, space, and time are not particularly germane in this place. They are taken up on a much higher theoretical level in Scientology. But the essence of time is that it is measured or marked by the motion of particles in space. Space and energy particles are necessary to have mechanical time. But what is time, basically? Time is actually consideration. There is time because one considers there is time. You must examine the physical universe very closely to discover that the reason it is always here is because it is, each and every particle of it, each cubic inch of space of it, in forever. The physical universe is not moving through time, it is stuck in time. Each and every part of it is fixed in a now which lasts forever. The only real changes which take place in the physical universe are those introduced into it by life. We can argue about this if we want to, but we are interested here in a concept which leads toward a workable process. We discover that time exists for the individual to the degree that the individual makes time. Time is an other-determined thing to nearly everyone alive. He depends on clocks. He depends on the rising and setting of the sun. He depends on all manner of mechanisms to tell him what is the time. Actually, the more a person is told what the time is, the more he gets into a dependency upon some other consideration, and so he drops into forever. When he stops considering that he is making time, when he stops making time by considerations, he is dropping himself into a foreverness. He has less and less motion. He has less and less determinism. Time is a very insidious barrier because its apparency would tell an individual that time is created by the movement of things. Actually, it is not. It is created by a consideration that things are moving. Remedy of the barrier of time. The remedy of the barrier of time produces an astonishing effect upon a pre-clear. This process is the essence of simplicity. It has one command. The command is, make some time. This is all the command there is. One does not advise or teach the pre-clear how to make some time. One accepts whatever the pre-clear decides, makes time, as the answer. One maintains two-way communication with the pre-clear and answers comments which the pre-clear has on it. One carefully does not evaluate for the pre-clear and tell him how to make some time. One does not set an example of making time. One simply has the pre-clear make some time. This process, on some cases, has to be run many hours before the pre-clear comes into partial control of the barrier of time. When he does this, he of course comes into some control of his engram bank and his considerations. The making of time naturally puts into motion all those silent or motionless masses which are hanging to the pre-clear and which actually pin together his reactive bank. This is an enormous joke upon the pre-clear, by himself and the universe, that he makes all the time he will ever perceive. He cannot possibly get out of phase with forever if he is in contact with the foreverness of space and energy masses of which this universe is composed. When he starts to protest against the universe at large, he starts to protest against the foreverness which includes all time. And so he withdraws into earlier times when he was making time in order to have some himself. Make some time is a process of astonishing ramifications. But remember, time is a barrier. One could also say, make some space, make some energy, make some objects, make some terminals, and have gains in a pre-clear. But these are barriers. Although a game requires barriers, the pre-clear already has too many in the past, too few in the present. Barriers are not life. 3 cardinal rules in processing. We must use 3 cardinal rules in processing. 1. Process toward the truth. 2. Process toward ability. 3. Process toward life. Auditing commands must emphasize truth, ability, life. Don't process toward N-theta, chronic somatics, difficulties. Ignore them. The only thing wrong with the pre-clear is that his attention is fixed on barriers. MEST. His freedom depends upon putting his attention on freedom or present time. Here are 2 auditing commands. Which is correct? 1. Find some things you can't do. 2. Find some things you can do. The second is correct. The first will almost spin a pre-clear. Why? Because it concentrates on a lie. A pre-clear can do anything. A pre-clear has a bad leg. Which is the right process? 1. Touch the back of your chair. 2. Recall a time when somebody hurt his leg. The first is correct. It is faster. Why? Because it processes toward ability. We have a pre-clear who is apathetic. Which process is the right one? 1. Who used to have headaches? 2. Feel the floor beneath your feet. The second is correct because it processes toward life, not illness. That which the auditor concentrates upon in auditing comes true. Hence, the processing of MEST gives us new barriers. The processing of life gives new life. Processing barriers gives us limited processes. Processing life gives us unlimited processes. Life is composed of affinity, reality, communication. These make understanding. ARC processing. Modern ARC processing processes communication, as given earlier in this volume. ARC processing includes the following powerful processes. 1. Tell me something you might communicate with. Tell me something that would communicate with you. 2. What might you agree with? What might agree with you? 3. Tell me something you would like. Tell me something that might like you. These are present time, not past or future processes. They produce very strong reactions. They solve very rough cases. They are summed in a simple process which does not dispense with them. Tell me something, someone you could understand. Tell me something, someone who could understand you. Note, of course, a very basic process which resolves chronic somatics, eye difficulties, any specific item is to have the affected part or bad area of energy say hello and okay and all right until it is in good condition. Not that an auditor should address specific conditions. LRH. Chapter 16. Exteriorization. The auditor will be confronted with a great many problems in exteriorization once he has exteriorized his pre-clear. The things to do and not to do are as follows. 1. Do not require the awareness of awareness unit to again put its attention on the body. 2. Do not make a person prove that he is exteriorized. 3. Do not make a newly exteriorized person discover, find things, read the future, or do other nonsensical tricks. 4. Maintain the auditor's code more severely than before. 5. Continue the process on which the pre-clear exteriorized. If the auditor knows these things, he will not get the pre-clear and himself into trouble. The auditing command, "Be 3 feet back of your head," sometimes gets the auditor into more trouble than he is equipped to handle. The pre-clear may do a compulsive exteriorization, do a bunk, and drop his body limp in the chair and give from that body no sign that he is hearing any of the auditing commands given by the auditor. One such case was pleaded with for half an hour by an auditor, along the lines that the pre-clear should remember her husband, should think of her children, should come back and live for the sake of her friends, and found no response from the pre-clear. Finally, the auditor said, "Think of your poor auditor," at which moment the pre-clear promptly returned. A limited compulsive exteriorization is the pre-clear going out of the body and getting plastered against the ceiling or falling in terror upward into the sky, an inverting of gravity. This manifestation is equally upsetting. If a pre-clear has been given the command, "Be 3 feet back of your head," and if he does a bunk or if he falls out of the body upward, all the auditor has to do is get in two-way communication with the pre-clear. Actually, he should have, as an auditor, an excellent command of the chart of human evaluation of science of survival. He would then not tell a pre-clear below 2.0 on the tone scale to be 3 feet back of your head. For when they do, at these lower levels of the tone scale, it is on a compulsive or obsessive level, and all the pre-clear can think of is to try and get away. Another remedy, if this untoward and strange occurrence happens, is to ask the pre-clear to reach from your position to your body, withdraw from the body, reach for the body, withdraw from the body, or decide to run away and run away several times. Remember, such things as this occur only when the auditor has not placed his pre-clear on the tone scale before he began to audit him. The way to get away from these entirely is to audit the 6 basic processes on the pre-clear, and then audit either or both of the one-shot clear processes or remedying scarcity of communication and ARC processing until the pre-clear exteriorizes. And then simply go right on auditing the process which exteriorized the pre-clear. Remember that a pre-clear exteriorized is simply an awareness of awareness unit which has been taken out of a trap. And the awareness of awareness unit has not changed any from the basic individual, but now recognizes itself to be out of the trap and is quite happy about it. A very funny manifestation occurs on some very low-toned pre-clears. When they talk about exteriorization, they say, "I'm over there." This, of course, is impossible. An individual is always here. It is here where you are. Lord knows what this individual who says, "I'm over there," has exteriorized, a circuit, a mock-up, some such thing. He himself definitely is not. Another manifestation we have is buttered all over the universe. A pre-clear who is buttered all over the universe is one who does not know where he is. And if we ask him many, many times, over and over and over, each time making him get a spot with certainty, "Can you find a spot where you are not?" we will gradually narrow down his area. What has actually happened in such a case is that the pre-clear has used remote viewpoints and has left remote viewpoints located all over, everywhere, to such a degree that the pre-clear thinks he is any place rather than where he is. The main thing one has to know about exteriorization is that it takes place. If one uses the 6 basic processes, remembers the auditor's code and the 2 one-shot clear processes, he is then quite safe on exteriorization. For it will occur only when it occurs, and the thing to do after it occurs is to do the same process one has been doing when it occurs. Of course, one should acknowledge the fact of the pre-clear's mentioning it, and one should certainly permit the pre-clear to discuss it. But one should continue with the process which exteriorized him, unless, of course, one is very well trained in exteriorization exercises. As exteriorization drilling as an activity is most germane to the realm of Scientology, further knowledge of it and about it is written up in The Creation of Human Ability. Here is given the Route 1 steps which should be run after an exteriorization takes place. The creation of a clear, undertaken in 1950, actually was this manifestation of exteriorization happening at some random moment, and not being adequately cared for after it occurred. Nobody remarked upon the fact that he was a distance from the body because most of the people who were thus exteriorized had very good visio on their own banks, but very poor visio on the immediate environment. A little more exteriorization work and any one of these clears would have suddenly found themselves out into the room, looking at the room directly without the aid of eyes. We wanted clears in 1950. We still want clears. This is the way to make them, the way to make them stable, the way to make anybody you process far more able. The byword on this is not to address specific errors or difficulties, but to validate abilities and process immediately toward the acquisition of further and higher abilities. We are not in there to pay attention to all the bad things in the world, since these are composed only of the imaginings of the individual. Let us increase the ability of the individual to create, to be, to perceive, and increase his ability to associate all along the dynamics. If we should do this, it would be a far, far better world.